All right, Rocco, I will turn things over to you to officially open the event.
Thanks so much, Donald, and welcome everyone to what is going to be a fabulous 2 days. While we meet in cyberspace, of course, all of us are in different parts of Turtle Island. Myself, I'm coming to you from the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa and Wendat peoples, and all of us owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people who have stewarded the lands and waters for generations. And of course, the single best way we can acknowledge and thank them for that is to commit to redoubling our efforts to the path towards truth and reconciliation. This next 2 days of the Ontario Chambers of Commerce Diversity in Business ROI Conference is really the brainchild of our Discoverability Network, one of the true crown jewels of the OCC. And I want to give a big shout out to the team that leads that and that is putting together the conference, because this is not simply about social justice. It's about economic necessity in a world that is moving rapidly to an increasing war for talent. There simply is no room to let anyone leave anyone behind. And so we've brought together some amazing speakers to help think about strategies to maximize the potential that is out there, and to, as the name says, discoverability wherever it is. I want to thank the speakers. I want to thank the Government of Canada for their continuous support of the network. Our event partners, DSV Solutions, CBC, the Ontario Restaurant, Hotel and Motel Association, the employment service providers that have been such great partners, WCG, Canadian Council on Rehabilitation and Work, Live, Work, Play, the Toronto District School Board, and all the employers and job seekers that have engaged with the Discoverability platform. And we hope that just continues to grow. So let's get that conversation going. I'm going to be joining a couple of amazing people in Fireside Chat. And so I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Donald Sala, to introduce these fantastic people we'll be talking with.
Thank you, Rocco. It is my pleasure to introduce your speaking companions for the Fireside Chat on the importance of the disability demographic to Ontario workforce development, although I'd like to assure everybody that there will be no clips from the Fireplace channel being shared. The first speaker I have the privilege to introduce is Diane J. Brisebois, President and CEO of the Retail Council of Canada. Diane has held that position since 1995. She has been leading industry associations in Canada for more than 40 years. The RCC represents over 45,000 retail establishments across Canada, which account for more than 75% of all retail sales in the country. She currently serves on the advisory boards of St. Mary's University, David Sobey Centre for Innovation in Retailing and Services, University of Alberta School of Business Retailing Program, Federation of International Retail Associations, the Golden Pencil Award Executive Advisory Committee, and is a member of the Board of Directors of the Canada's Children's Hospital Foundations. Diane also served as the chairman of the board of the Canadian Society of Association Executives, the Traffic Injury Research Foundation, the Fair Factory Clearinghouse, and the Federation of International Retail Associations. In addition, Diane has served on the board and board committees of the Quebec Employers Council, Toronto Region Board of Trade, Covenant House Toronto, Ryerson University's School of Retail, Business Advisory Board of the World Wildlife Federation, and Capital Fundraising Committee of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health Foundation.
And that's day one of the conference.
Right? Diane has received several recognitions, including but not limited to the Pinnacle Award in recognition of exceptional leadership and outstanding contribution to the association community in Canada, the Founders of Canada's Digital Economy Award in recognition of outstanding contribution to the advancement of the digital economy, the Businesswoman of the Year Award presented by the Italian Chamber of Commerce of Ontario, Canada. The next speaker I'd like to introduce is Jake Hirsch-Allen, who is the North America Workforce Development and Higher Education System Lead for LinkedIn. Jake builds public-private partnerships between North America's governments, workforce development organizations, colleges and universities, and LinkedIn Talent Solutions. Through this work, Jake supports and is learning to be an ally to groups such as newcomers and refugees, Indigenous populations, the formerly incarcerated, and people with disabilities. Jake advises several startups, including Hire Guide and Readocracy. He speaks regularly on the changing nature or future of work and learning, and is passionate about skills-based hiring and learning. Jake is a director on the boards of the Canadian Council for Youth Prosperity, Information and Communications Technology Council, and the Canadian Club. He founded Lighthouse Labs, Canada's foremost software development bootcamp, and Hacking Health. A former intellectual property and international criminal lawyer, Jake was also chair of the Technology Committee of the Global Education Platform, taught global health at McMaster University, and clerked at the Supreme Court of Israel. And finally, although you all know Rocco, I'd like to add some background information.
Oh, please don't.
Well, I'm going to anyway. Rocco Rossi is president and CEO of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce, a successful entrepreneur and business executive, champion fundraiser, and dedicated public servant. Rocco Rossi joined the Ontario Chamber of Commerce in 2018 as president and CEO. Prior to joining the OCC, Mr. Rossi most recently served as president and CEO of Prostate Cancer Canada, where he helped to advance the research, advocacy, education, and awareness of the most common cancer in men. Mr. Rossi also served as CEO of Heart and Stroke Foundation, one of Canada's largest nonprofit organizations, overseeing consecutive years of record fundraising combining for over $500 million in total and launching many new life-saving initiatives. Mr. Rossi has held senior positions at the Boston Consulting Group, Torstar, Labatt Interbrew, and MGI Software. He is a graduate of McGill and Princeton. So Rocco, I would like to invite you to lead us off and share your thoughts on the biggest challenges facing businesses right now and how workforce development factors into this conversation.
Thanks so much, Donald. And we all bask in the reflected glory of Deanne Brisbois' amazing CV. So delighted to be here today. Look, at the OCC, we are constantly surveying our members, some 60,000 businesses across this province, every corner, public, private, small, large. And even before the pandemic, the number one issue that was raised as what our members see as the key obstacle to both their and the economy's future success is the skills gap and our labor shortages. And in our latest survey for our Ontario Economic Support, again, number one, with over 62% of members surveyed identifying this key shortages issue. So we're with two amazing panelists, Deanne looking at the retail sector across Canada, and Jake with that incredible window he has on the labor market through the powerful engine known as LinkedIn. Let's first talk about this whole labor shortage issue more generally, and then we'll dive into some of the solutions. But Deanne, what are you hearing from your members right now?
Thank you, Rocco. I think I know that we're hearing what you at the Chamber are hearing. There's a huge issue with labor shortage right across retail organizations. So it's not only at the front end, which is what consumers see. So that means staff in store, but we're seeing shortages at head office for larger retail operations and distribution centers and the likes. A challenge as well for the retail sector is that there's labor shortage also throughout its supply chain. So be it transportation, it would be a perfect example. And with the suppliers who sell products to retail. So it's a huge problem. And it's probably a greater problem in retail, specifically because a large percentage of employees are front of store, so young people. And there's traditionally been high turnover in those positions in retail. So this has just exacerbated the problem. And so those challenges continue. So it's a bit bleak right now, but we are encouraged by what retailers are doing to attract and to retain, which is extremely important, these employees. But it is quite challenging at this time.
Great. And Jake, what are the numbers showing you? What are the listings, the time it takes to recruit, and what you're hearing from your subscribers and users of the network?
It's a really important question, Rocco, because our economy, our labor market is so tight right now. As you said, the top issue for almost every employer of size is talent, is ensuring in retail, as Diane's saying, but really right across the board. We're talking everything from tourism and retail to consulting firms, finance, and big tech struggling. Now, in the States, the market's actually been quite different, I think, than Canada, both over the pandemic and right now. In many ways, our labor market has actually been much tighter. The talk of a great resignation in the US is very much a great reshuffle in Canada, where folks are seeking better jobs, to Diane's point, often leaving, for instance, retail roles because other roles that are either paying a different living wage or offering different benefits or even just different career opportunities. Those roles are being filled, but they're leaving other empty roles, as Diane was pointing out. And it really is that shuffling that's really causing pain for employers across Canada in a labor market that, despite what looks like a potential recession, remains incredibly tight. And so if you have high inflation, a potential recession, and a really tight labor market, figuring out how to treat employees right and figuring out how to hire that entire labor market, not just the components that you've always been going back to over and over again, is perhaps the single most important step that companies can take to ensure their success in the coming months and years.
So I want to dive right into that point because you set it up well. There was a time when diversity and inclusion and talk around that was a box that C-suites had to tick, but not necessarily take all that seriously. What are you seeing concretely that people are doing? Clearly, we have a focus over these 2 days in the disability community, but really this is all about all underrepresented groups. So it's Indigenous, it's at-risk youth, it's newcomers, it's women, groups whose participation rate is simply not at the levels we need them to be at as an economy, and they need to be at in order to have fulfilled lives.
DE&I is in many ways the most important aspect of a company, period. It's not just of their talent, but really of the company as a whole. And the reason I say that is because study after study shows that if you can enable your talent to produce at their full capacity, i.e., if you can create that environment that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, you will be, enabling them to produce more, but also your consumers will buy more for you. They will like your brand better. Your employees will stay longer. Across almost every metric of company success, once you have that alignment, we did a study, interestingly, about 6 years ago at LinkedIn on purpose and the alignment, for instance, of employees' values with the values of their company. To the extent that companies achieve that purpose, and DE&I actually is often a key component of it and vice versa, those companies will across the board do better than the companies that aren't hiring from this entire labor market and empowering those they hire to stay through forms of equity and inclusion.
Diane, the retail sector is a massive employer, a lot of first-time jobs, but full careers spent in the sector. What are you seeing that's changed on this front of diversity and inclusion? And as you said earlier, not just attracting, but retaining employees. And are you seeing some best practices that we can share?
Yes, I am. But I will say that it has been slow, Rocco. And we are a sector that employs approximately 2 million Canadians. And when we look at the percentage of employees who would fall in what we would call diversity. So I will use that in the general term as you described. It is still low. And in fact, we just did a study about a year ago to look at the different sectors within retail. And that, by that I mean general merchandise retail like fashion, hard goods, and we looked at pharmacy, and then we looked at grocery. We found that in the non-food, non-pharma, there were certainly more efforts and a better representation on the diversity front. So there's a lot of work to be done across the board, but certainly much more to be done in pharma and in food. However, saying that, you know what they say, there's always a silver lining in a crisis. And what the pandemic has done is really bring the issue of diversity and inclusion in the labor force and training and attracting and retaining in the C-suite. The executives are not just talking about it, but living it. And that's key. What we have seen, and that is really the positive step, is their understanding that it doesn't just have to be discussed. It can't just be discussed in the C-suite. It can't be a cosmetic program. It has to be embedded in the organization. And the results have been, for those who've really engaged and made commitments, is bring not only people in the senior management, but in mid-management and junior management. Because I think we'll all acknowledge that for people to be able to grow in an organization, they have to believe that they're supported at the entry level and that they can see people at the junior management and senior management levels that look like them, that come from the same backgrounds, that have the same challenges as they have. And so we're starting to see that. Some of the great, some of the retailers, and I'm talking about large ones, and I'm always careful because I don't want to exclude them, but I think Walmart is probably a very good example of an organization that's taken D&I at heart and to heart. And it has not only been hiring and retaining a labor force that is representative of our population, but it has partnered with the right organizations that understand the opportunities and challenges for people with disabilities, for racialized populations, for youth at risk, and they work in partnership with them long-term. I think the lesson that the retailers are learning is this is not something you do in a year. This is something that needs to be part of your culture. That's something you need to put the microscope on all of your initiatives. And you need to have very, very clear goals and desired outcomes and measure yourself honestly against them. The one good thing, Rocco, about retail is it's very front-facing. It's a window to society. And so retailers that don't take this seriously and don't do good work as they should will be judged more than they ever have been. The reputation of a retail organization is now part of the narrative of consumers when they make buying choices. And so while we can argue that that's not a good reason, I believe it is. It is what will drive them to understand that they don't only need to serve customers, they need to reflect the customer's lifestyle, beliefs, and culture. And I think that because of that, we're starting to make much more progress.
Right. But, Deanne, you were very honest in saying that, look, it's still going slower than any of us would like. And Jake, I want to follow up with you on this because, the tale of the tape is still disappointing and frightening. You've got people with disabilities with unemployment rates that are double or more the average in the economy. You have companies that still have sort of outdated biases and misperceptions about what it takes and what accommodations might have to be made. What are you seeing more generally that is looking at attacking these misperceptions and putting in place the kind of information that we need to really continue to move that dial?
I think stats are one thing that helps, and I appreciated that you didn't just focus on people with disabilities, but rather, as much as that is perhaps amongst the most glaring absences, particularly in Canada, even women's participation in the labor market remains below the levels it should be, and obviously was particularly negatively impacted by the pandemic, just like people with disabilities were particularly impacted by this pandemic. So part of what we have to interpret is how, or see and respond to, is how these populations in particular are being negatively affected relative to everybody else. And in some ways, we're backsliding. I think retail, I don't actually have the stats on comparing retail to tech in front and center in my mind, but in many ways, retail is actually doing better than areas like tech, which has the resources, certainly up until the past couple months, had the resources to hire in a diverse manner. But I was hearing yesterday that women in tech have decreased by 10% in the US over the past decade or two. We were at 35%, and now we're at 25%. And so if we're backsliding on some of these key metrics, and in areas where one could argue it might actually be easier to integrate, for instance, women as a whole into this category, in part due to their visibility, the reality seems to be the exact opposite. And it brings to mind in me a bit of the human aspect as opposed to just the statistical or economic aspects of how to persuade companies to change. How do you use sort of behavioral economics and behavior change theory and sort of change transformation to work with the human beings behind these companies to help them adopt practices that will hire more, as opposed to just showing them stats and sort of browbeating them with best practices. And one thing that comes to mind in this respect is specifically the participation on boards. If you look over time at board participation, just in the past couple decades, gay men, as an example, have overtaken women and Blacks in terms of their percentage representation on boards as it relates to their percentage of the population as a whole. And in part, in my mind, that's because of the difference in terms of visibility between the minority that is a gay man. Often you can't see that he is gay, and women. We obviously can see the difference between men and women, and Blacks, where it would seem that there's actually been even less progress in some cases, again, backsliding. And so I think if you see the same thing with people with disabilities, it'll be interesting to actually break down this population. Those of us who struggle with non-visual, disabilities that you can't see are often much more able to sort of operate in a work environment than those who are stigmatized, particularly, for instance, in retail. And Diana, you probably know much more about this than I, by having a disability that one can see. And yet, across all of the spectrum of disability, we will all at some point be disabled, right? Every human being at some point in their lifetime will have a disability of one kind or another. And as such, over the spectrum of all of the population, what we really need to do is to figure out how to integrate us, all of us with our disabilities, into the labor market in order to make it both most efficient from an economic perspective, but then again, getting back to that behavioral change aspect, so that we actually feel like the world in which we're operating in is healthier, is better, is making us happier because of that diversity. And when you see a board that represents society, I am confident that board is going to literally feel better as well as produce more and be more efficient, and shepherd companies and organizations through this constantly changing world in a more humane, and also economically efficient manner.
Well, we definitely aspire to that and are working towards it. But Deanne, what do you see as the things that are really making this slower than it should be? So if we identify what the holdbacks are, maybe we can try to address those to accelerate the process. What do you think is behind the slowness of the uptake?
Rocco, you know me well, so I always say I need to be careful about what I'm going to say, and I end up not being careful. about what I'm going to say.
That's why we love you and have you.
There are still way too many companies run by white Anglo-Saxon men, bottom line. And not that I'm suggesting that there should be a law or regulations that state that a percentage of should be, but unless we are incentivized in some way to ensure that representation, I think the progress will continue to be slow. I believe, though, and I think Jake commented on that or alluded to that a bit earlier, it needs to be in the narrative. It needs to be covered in the media. Companies need to know that they will be judged and are judged by their ability to respect and support diversity within their organization. The problem, Rocco, I believe, is that for the longest time, until up to the pandemic, diversity, certainly in our industry, was much more focused around the customer, how to serve the diverse customers. And there was very little thought about, you can't guess how to serve a diverse customer unless you have a diverse workforce. I am, however, a bit more optimistic because of what's happened during the pandemic, and because a lot of executives have had to, and human resources departments have had to rethink work environments, priorities, and lifestyles. And because, as Jake noted, of labor force shortages, open their doors more widely. So at this point, I don't care if they were forced to do it, if their circumstances make them do it. At the end of the day, it's good news. But we still need to make sure that this is not something that you read about every couple of months. It's something that's discussed, that's part of the narrative on a daily basis, because the people within the organization need to start thinking that way. And we know that the only way that happens is if you hear that message repeated, and visually shown to people, so that it becomes part of your DNA. And so the most important thing for us as we go forward is to ensure that that becomes one of the 3 most important topics that are discussed within a corporation. And there's nothing wrong with naming and shaming. That's the one beautiful thing about retail is customers, people do listen to customers. And so customers are speaking out, and they are choosing in general to shop with those brands that reflect their values. And we need more customers to do that in order to ensure that the progress we've made continues, and that this no longer becomes part of a webinar on how to, but becomes a webinar about how well we've integrated everybody within our workforce.
Diana, I wonder if I can jump in really quickly, because I thought there was 3 points there that over both of your most recent remarks really resonated for me. And I've been working super closely with the Walmart Foundation in the US, which has been adopting a lot of the same practices that LinkedIn has. In fact, I would argue in some ways we're following their lead as a foundation in not just sort of burnishing the image of Walmart, but rather it's not lipstick, it's actually changing the makeup of the company and the middle management, to your point, that both represents diversity to those who they're hiring at the front line, but also it's the middle management that hires their own community. If you have somebody of color or somebody with a disability or a woman in a middle management role, it automatically increases the chances that they're both going to hire and retain people who look, walk, and talk like them. And a ton of what we've been focusing on both at the Walmart Foundation and at LinkedIn now is how do you move from hiring people based on who they know from a network perspective, when most of them are white men in power doing that hiring, How do you move away from degrees, which similarly have in many ways institutionalized discrimination, including against people with disabilities? And how do you move away from years of experience, where those years of experience often are just characterized by what those in power describe as experience, when in reality, and this is sort of my favorite example for Canada, because we have so many newcomers and refugees, if you look at a refugee crossing a border over 5 years, they are learning so many skills, from language skills to resilience, from project management with their 5 kids as they shuffle through 6 border crossings and have to create a new life, et cetera, et cetera. But those skills aren't represented in the way that most of us think of experience, just as the resilience of a person with disability navigating a world that is not designed for them, and in fact is often designed counter to what would be beneficial for us all, is a sign in and of itself of resilience that we need to enable those individuals both to express better and hiring managers to hire for. And so I really loved your comment on both Walmart and on how that sort of representation at the middle management level has to change. And I think movements like skills-based hiring are really at the core of how we can fix this if they include an equity lens. And I think, to your point, sometimes we actually have to mandate those equity lenses.
Right. Look, Deanne, you made the point about, you need to turn this into one of those top 3 items, and Jake, you mentioned some people like Walmart who've done this. But look, there are some 1 million jobs going empty right now in Canada. If that doesn't constitute a burning platform, when are we going to get there? And we've been focusing a lot on the companies, but I also want to look at it from the standpoint of the applicants and people looking to break in from these underrepresented groups. And Jake, to you to kick it off, because you mentioned the issue around, degrees can be a bit of institutionalized bias, but the reality is you are far more likely to be unemployed if you're a person with disability that has a degree, and a ton of them have degrees, than if you're a white male who's just graduated high school. So the degree doesn't necessarily always do everything that you would hope for it. But what are the things that the applicants themselves should be looking at to put themselves in the best position?
A great question. And it's a question that I'm shocked at how many folks ask themselves or ask the world without good answers, because career development should be, at this point, fundamental to both education and the work environment. And yet most of us, even before I worked at LinkedIn 5-6 years ago, I didn't know how to represent my own skills, my own experience in a manner that would allow me to get in front of the employers that I was most interested in. And so that is, to flip it, the answer, which is you have to understand how to describe your experience using the words that the employers you want to hire you use in order to search for you. And in some ways, if you look at the LinkedIn platform, it'll sort of describe and prompt exactly how to do that. First of all, we are pushing skills before degrees and years of experience now as you fill in your profile. But equally importantly, the skills that we're prompting you are actually populated by employers when they fill in job descriptions. So we're taking what employers are asking for in terms of skills, and then we're recommending, as you fill in your LinkedIn profile, that you use those words to describe the skills that you have. And that's true on LinkedIn, but that works equally well in a resume or on another platform. The key is that you as an individual learn to represent the skills that you have and communicate them in the words, in the manner that employers are hiring for. And that is particularly true with all of the communities that are discriminated against, because often their difference in background comes with a difference in communication. And so on the employer side, they too have to understand that individuals who come speaking from a different background, my favorite example in the US is if you graduate from an Ivy League, you define communication in one relatively clear manner that most of us who have sort of operated with privilege understand. Flip that, and if you graduate from what's called a historically Black college or university, you're often going to speak with a different accent, with different mannerisms. You're going to have a different history to the language that you use. And we often rate that as worse communication. When it's not worse, it's just different communication. And so as an employer, you have to recognize that some of the value that the individual is providing is the fact that they communicate differently than you, rather than the fact that they look or talk or walk just like you. It's actually the difference that is value for your organization.
No, and those are great points. And in fact, it's also a key part of the Discoverability Network platform, because there you're also, in addition, talking to employers who are specifically looking into these groups. And so lining up those skills together with motivated employers is super powerful. Deanne, how, for those looking to break into the retail sector, what might you add to Jake's advice for people to set themselves up for success?
I think Jake gave some really, really good advice. This is going to sound a bit controversial, but for a lot of good employers who are working very hard at ensuring that their workforce is representative, I think you use your disability as an advantage. And that sounds very strange, but I can say that because having been and having had and continue to have employees with disabilities, I will always remember one of our employees saying, "I have an advantage over you. I have had greater challenges, and I am more empathetic, and I am more aware of the people around me." So one of the things I would do, Rocco, is using your network and looking at the employers in retail who are very progressive and who understand that it's important to have a diverse workforce and you have the opportunities. This is the best time to find employment and to sell yourself as, in fact, underrepresented. In the past, that would have been unheard of. But today, I say be opportunistic, because employees are looking for you. And don't undersell yourself. You are important to them, and they know that. I have noticed in hiring people of color, people with disability, that they tend to be humble, shy. And I'm saying to them, don't be. In fact, use what's defined you in society as an advantage. This is your time. The first step is to get in, to build your resume. Find those companies. We talked about Walmart. Sobeys is another great example of a company doing amazing, amazing things in the workforce. Lululemon is another one. There are several, and you find them, you apply, and you use who you are as an advantage. And that, I think, we could not have said that 3 years ago.
Now, sometimes that specialness does require a certain amount of accommodation and accessibility for a certain segment within the disabled population is big. Deanne, what are you seeing? And it's a question that's come in from the audience on the movement to greater accessibility on the retail front, and how do you see that evolving so that that people can choose places to work where they are going to readily be able to fit in and to work because the places have been made accessible?
It's a great question, and I wish I could give you. I wish I could lie, so I'm not going to lie. The retail sector has not done well in accommodating people with disabilities. There are regulations that have improved the situation, but not to the extent that I would say is acceptable. One of the things that we are trying to do, Rocco, and I know the chamber is doing a lot of work in this area, is working with our members and developing training and working with provincial and territorial and federal governments to provide grants to businesses, because we often talk about the very large, but as we all know, the majority of businesses are SMEs, and they often don't. And in retail, it's a bit more complex because you're talking about a store environment, a back room, maybe a small distribution center. So there are a lot of moving parts. There are grants that are available. I believe that there should be more, but I also believe that the standard, the acceptable standard, should be increased across the country. And so that, again, hate using the stick, but sometimes forcing is the only solution. So, to kind of recap, the retail sector has a lot of work to do. There are a few that are that have done well, but it's certainly not the majority. And I think also Retail Council of Canada has a much greater role to play to provide the resources, the tools to ensure that retailers as employers can accommodate all types of employees, and specifically employees and customers with disabilities. So that it's a long road ahead, Rocco.
And yet, as dark as that sort of story is, Diane, I think in some ways we can also be proud that Ontario is further ahead than most places on the planet, right? Like the flip side of what you're describing is not, I completely agree. We have a huge way to go, and you know better than I, particularly in retail. On the other hand, as LinkedIn and as Microsoft, part of what we've been really excited about in being in Ontario, and I think part of why it's representative that the Ontario Chamber of Commerce is hosting this conversation, is that the Ontario Disability Act is literally what we build our software to. It's the standard to which we aspire, because it's amongst the highest standards in the world. And it's in doing so, in ensuring that when you watch our video content on LinkedIn Learning, or when you try to recruit somebody on LinkedIn Recruiter, or you're in Microsoft Word, in each of those cases, we're aspiring to meet the highest standards in the world. And thankfully, we're in one of the places that sort of enforces those standards, at least on companies like ours in tech that, to be transparent, are probably easier to shift from a accommodation perspective than, as you said, SMB storefronts. But nevertheless, I do think we're doing a pretty good job here in Ontario, and we can be proud of that.
Yeah, there's no question from a jurisdictional point of view, Ontario has made enormous progress, but I think we would all agree there's so much more that needs to be done, especially when we look at where the employment opportunities are.
Completely.
And so there are sectors that are not as advanced or not as invested as others. And so in this case, it may be more important to start looking at, sector by sector. So not liking to talk about silos, but in this case, we may need to. And again, Rocco, going back to the point I made about diversity, where it should be the top 3 issues in your organization. Employing people with disabilities should be very much on a part of those 3 priorities.
Yeah, I'm heartened by the comments about where we are relative to some other jurisdictions, and always reminded of the great Martin Luther King Jr., who loved to quote an old spiritual that said, we ain't where we should be, and we ain't where we're gonna be, but thank Lord Almighty we ain't where we was.
Yeah.
And there is that. And Jake, you and I the other day were having a conversation again from that global perspective, because look, we've got a long way to go, and we have, as I kicked off at the start, this incredible open wound with respect to our Indigenous communities, but as a country, we're one of the few in the world that has this level of immigration, this level of diversity, that has, relative to other models, done quite well, and hopefully is a bit a part of the enabler and the context to move forward even further in these key areas where we clearly still have enormous failings. But why don't you, and you were talking about the Netherlands and a few other examples, and I'd love to get that context for the audience.
Totally. I don't know the today's stat, because we are adding so many members to LinkedIn every day that which country has the most membership per capita literally changes sometimes by the day. Nevertheless, for the longest time, Canada and the Netherlands were right at the top in terms of just members on LinkedIn. So we have, like 80% of our population, or something of our working population already with an account. And part of that membership is an indication of the access to opportunity in that country. It shows that in Canada, the vast majority of people are actively seeking career development, seeking networking, seeking new opportunities in a way that most countries haven't technologically or otherwise enabled people to search. And to your point, in my mind, and this is an association that is sort of correlation without studies to back it up or causation, but you can imagine that we are probably the single country that has integrated newcomers better than any other, right? So Germany and we probably rival each other these days for the ability to integrate new populations. And these are often coming from other parts of the world, refugees coming with their own baggage, et cetera, literal and figurative. But rather, in this case, if we can do such an amazing job at integrating newcomers, at integrating other aspects of Canada's population. For instance, the Ontario Disability Employment Network has few parallels in the world. We're doing, again, relatively well in Ontario, but to actually integrate those populations the same way, as you mentioned, Indigenous populations, people with disabilities, the same way that we have managed to with regard to newcomers, if we could be the global standard in those two respects as well, then I think our companies would do even better. They would be models of the ability to create that diverse workforce that we already know delivers better across every metric. Customers buy more, companies, brands do better, they retain their people better. And I know this is the second time I'm saying many of these things, but to Diane's point, I think we need to say them over and over again to the point where they become truisms, so that talent becomes Canada's single strongest asset. If you look in the US, every governor in their top 3 priorities has workforce development. That's not necessarily the case in Canada right now. Employment services aren't right at the top of the list of what premiers are focusing on across our country. And yet perhaps it should be, and specifically it should be vis-a-vis the populations we're talking about today, the populations that aren't already in the workforce. Because once they're there, once we're doing as well on Indigenous populations and people with disabilities as we are with newcomers, then I really think Canada will be the model economically as well as from an inclusion perspective for the world.
Rocco, let me...
Yeah, and Deanne, I want to go to you on this, and I want to add just another layer that hopefully you can incorporate, because Jake raises the issue of the U.S. governors and workforce development. We're in the middle of a provincial election last time I was checking, and I haven't heard a whole lot on this area. Are you, and how do we bring pressure to bear to make sure it moves up the priority list? So the theme more generally, and then if you could bring a little color to how we might organize to act.
Rocco, you and I have worked on some files in the past, and I think in any circumstance, if you want government to pay attention, you must speak out, and there must be lots of voices and lots of noise. I hate using this example, but we all saw what happened in Texas yesterday, and the horrible shooting. And I listened to this young man on CNN this morning who is an advocate, and he was saying that you don't just speak out when there's an election. You speak out and you demonstrate and you show up in between elections. And you do that constantly and you push. Again, a terrible analogy here, but they were talking about the gun lobby versus the non-gun lobby. And his point was, we only speak out when this happens, yet the gun lobby is lobbying every day. Every governor, every state, every legislator. So horrible analogy, but the point is that the only way this becomes a priority is if we make it a priority. And we make it a priority in every community, with every elected official, and we do it every day in an organized way or not so organized way. But obviously, Rocco, you know that as big business associations, we do have a voice. I think it's time now for us to come together with the major employers and interest groups and make sure that we address this daily. We don't just wait for the next election. And I think that that's the most important thing we're going to need to do, because I'm hearing more. I was on a call with officials and 7 very large retail employers who wanted to talk about diversity and inclusion, training, upskilling, and we were having a hard time even getting them there.
Right.
And so we're talking about people who were employing over 250,000 employees. And so that means that we haven't done our job well. And we need to go to the barricades, so to speak. I just want to address one thing because I'm conscious of the time. There was a question around, how do you ensure, especially when you're hiring people with disabilities, that in fact you are doing the right things to accommodate them, to include them, to allow them to be productive. Jake and I were talking about Walmart and Sobeys. One of the things that they've done that's been extremely successful is their HR inclusion committees include these people, and not just sitting at the table in charge of them. Yeah, so it doesn't matter if that person's been employed for 1 month or 3 months, they have a vote at the table, and they are given the job of speaking to the challenges. And then this committee's job is to then find ways to fix that problem or to meet that challenge. So the only way an employer can ensure that it is in fact doing the right thing for its employees, regardless of if it's a disability or if the person is from a different culture, it's by having them part of the solution and not being afraid to hear what they have to say, to think of it as constructive criticism that will make the employer better. If that mentality exists, then we get somewhere and we see progress.
Right. I'm mindful of the time, and I could carry on a long time, but I want to give Jake a chance to give 1-2 key takeaways as we wrap up, because Deanne just summed up in such a great way.
Sounds good. Yeah, happy to do so. And there's no way I'll be able to put a finger to Dan's summary, but the 3 levels I'll speak to are at sort of the macroeconomic level. And at that level, we know that our economy as a whole will do better if we employ the entire population, and we're missing a bunch of really important parts of the population, including people with disabilities. So Canada will do better, we know, if we can get these folks employed. At the employer level, we've just stated over and over again that these companies, probably every company in Canada would do better if it hired a person with a disability. And the reason is because it would increase the diversity of the thinking and the doing of that company. It would allow that company to deliver on almost any metric that you measure a company by at a higher level, because that is always the case when you have a diverse workforce. And then finally, at the level of the individual, you have to communicate the skills that you have. To Deanne's point, you have unique abilities that no one else has, in part because of your disability, but you have to be able to communicate that in the language that will appeal to the employers that you are applying to. And so if, for instance, in retail, you think you have a superpower in a particular direction, then ensure that you are linking it to the language that those employers in retail are using when they explain what they're looking for in a candidate. And the same is true on the employer side. you have to be using the language that is comprehensible and clear to students, to their educators, because the gap we talk about in skills in society is not a skills gap. It is a communications gap. And people with disabilities suffer amongst the most from that communications gap. So let's close it. Let's build a more inclusive society, more equitable society together, and we will have a more economically powerful Canada.
I want to thank both of you. I know everyone really enjoyed and had lots of takeaways. You know, our conference says ROI in it, and that usually means return on investment. What this is really about is return on inclusion, that I think both Jake and Deanne put so well. We know we have an enormous problem. There are a million jobs going unfilled. There is a burning platform. It is both an issue of social justice and economic necessity. Canada is well positioned, but we got a lot of work to do, and we got to do that work 365 days of the year, not just at election time. I'm going to hand it back to my phenomenal staff team, Donald, Lisa, and let's keep the conversation going and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Well, thank you very much. That was a brilliant conversation. I could have listened to that for another hour. I think a number of important things to take away from it. Certainly one of the things that stuck out to me is that the impacts of what are being discussed are across demographics. They're not isolated considerations or one issue, one group, but the considerations exist across multiple demographics, all of which overlap with each other, and people with disabilities and interact with each other. And although we're not yet where we want to be, we're at least moving in the right direction. So thank you for all of the insight and your expertise.